Good morning, everyone. Great to be here and look forward to the next 40 minutes. So just a little bit about myself, for those who don't know me. I started my career with Unilever on Maiden Wharf as an electronic engineer and did various roles and ended up being the global S&OP director for Unilever, defining the demand planning, supply planning and business planning model and rolling out to 140 countries. I was with Johnson & Johnson, Coca-Cola, and for the last 5 years I've been running a company called Neways, so improving the way that we plan and run our businesses. So today what we wanted to do is talk about fragile supply chains. We wanted to talk about what is this business operation chain, because we really focused on just a supply chain, but it's more than a supply chain. Talk about control towers and use some examples that we've used in industry, and then also talk about the synchronization, because we're now moving away from our own little bubbles. We always used to sit in our own little bubbles, and now we're sitting in a big bubble where we're all interdependent on each other, and we need to start synchronizing and collaborating with each other. So we've created a fragile supply chain. It's not that this supply chain has always suddenly got fragile. So what we've seen is that over the last 10 or 15 years, business has been focused on financial efficiency. That financial efficiency is, how can I make the product cheaper? How can I, in terms of consolidating multiple plants and areas. And what we found is by doing that, there's a lot of the stuff that comes from the East or in Europe with the way the European community has grown, you find that you'll have one factory supplying the entire Europe with one particular product. So as we've gone from this, what I call localized to regionalized supply chains, we've all of a sudden created a huge amount of additional movements and additional work that goes with it. And particularly if you just think about China, we all, a lot of us import a lot of products from China, but where does the China get its raw materials from? It gets it from all around the world. So we ship all the stuff into China, we process it, we convert it, and then we ship it all the way back. So we're creating all this additional work, all this additional movements of goods. We're also starting to see the increase of flows. Our ports are being congested, the rail networks are congested or maybe not efficient enough. And it's not only in this country, it's multiple countries we're seeing the inefficiency of the rail network. And a lot of that is caused by, again, for us trying to get some of the flows. And we'll talk about that later on. But if you just think about COVID, the flows of COVID have changed significantly on how we do things. But it's been exacerbated by the fact that Europe went through something called Brexit. Now, Brexit doesn't sound like it's much effect on Africa or the rest of the world, but in reality what's happened is that if you now are outside the European Union, so the UK is now outside of the European Union, it has a deal, so that means a deal that can move its goods in and out of the European community without paying any tariffs. Yay. However, because it's now outside of the European Union, it needs to still provide all the paperwork and documentation to move its goods. So previously, if you made something in the UK that had animal origin and had multiple ingredients, you just manufactured, you put it on a truck, and 3 days later, it was in Europe. Now, when you manufacture something, you need all the documentation. So you need, first of all, the origin of every single ingredient. So if any ingredients are from outside of the European community, so for instance, if it's coming from Brazil, you now have to pay a tax on that because it's not in the UK, you've got to pay a tax on that ingredient. So you have to give every single ingredient to find where it comes from. Then if it's an animal product, it needs origin of where it came from the abattoir, or where it was caught, or where it comes from. And because it's now an animal product as well, you now need to have a vet certificate. So in order to move one item from the UK into Europe of food product, you need on average 40 documents to go with that, even though it's free trading. So all of a sudden, your lead time from moving from the UK to Europe has gone from 3 days to around 2.5 weeks, because once you've produced it, you can only then apply for those certifications. So it takes you a week to get all your paperwork in place, and then another week to move it, because you now need to cross borders and they also need to check it. So you've moved your flow, your increase for flow. But that means your containers or your trucks or your vehicles that you put the stuff into is now standing a lot longer. So all of a sudden, we've taken a whole lot of containers or transport out of the network. On top of that, Ireland, connected to mainland Europe, would transport all its stuff directly through the UK. So about 150,000 trucks would go through the UK to get to Ireland on a monthly basis. All of a sudden, those, if now traveling through UK, they all need 40 pieces of documentation per product on it. So if you've got 10 different products on your vehicle, that means you need 400, up to 400 pieces of document that's required to come through. So what's effectively happening, all of a sudden, from the UK to Ireland, there used to be 3 or 4 ferries a week of transport, because it was much more cost effective to go directly through. And it's also a lot quicker. All of a sudden, we're now bypassing the UK. You've now taken 140,000 trucks, or not all of them, about 100,000 out. And therefore, picking up points and doing backhauling is now all of a sudden gone. But also the time it takes for a ferry to go from mainland Europe to Ireland takes an extra 3 days in transportation. And again, we've now taken another 150,000 containers out of the system almost instantaneously. So it's not just what's happening in China or what's happening with COVID, but there's a lot of effects that are happening in the rest of the world that we need to come into. So we've created that because we drove efficiency, and all of a sudden that efficiency is gone, and we've got to find different flows and different ways of coming through. And then also what we find is we call it fragmented, because the decision making that happens is, again, we're all making decisions in our own little bubble. And also the supply chain network, between each one has pure communications. And that's what you'll see going through. We're moving into a new era of supply chain. And that era we're moving into is called synchronization. So previously we used to talk, if you talk about how supply chains evolved, it first started off with quality. If you didn't have the right quality, people wouldn't buy your product. Then we moved to cost. If you didn't have the right cost, people wouldn't buy your product. We then moved to service. If you haven't got your product on the shelves, people won't buy your product. So those are the 3, what we say, differentiators it used to be. Those are entry requirements. If you don't have those 3 now, you're not in the game. More recently, we've moved into things called flexibility. How quickly can we do bespoke, and speed that we can do. And those have become the differentiators. But that's not going to help us going forward. It's a synchronization. We need to synchronize not just what I need, but the whole network needs of where those containers are, where those ships are, where everything is. We all of a sudden have been pulled out of our individual bubbles, put into this now global bubble. And if we don't get into this synchronization, we're going to be in trouble. So what I've said over here is, who here have built in some mitigating plans? So when I talk to lots of businesses, they talk about the inputs and they talk about the exports. And what they effectively are saying is, you know what, it used to take me 2 or 3 months to get a product. Now it's taking me 6 or 7 months to get a product. So the question I ask you, who have put in mitigating risks, and what have you done? Because to say, I'm still waiting for it to come in 3 months, but I know it's going to be 7 months, but I'm going to disappoint my customers. If we can see a show of hands, who here in the supply chain have put in risk mitigation plans to mitigate those risks that we now, there's 1, 2, okay. So we've got a few hands, right. Be good to understand a little bit more about those things. But what we're finding is that the majority of businesses are not using what we call DEMCAT. So DEMCAP is called demonstrated capacity. So every month you would say, this is my demonstrated capacity, my actual capacity. This is my actual capacity of stuff coming in. And if we're not changing that on a monthly basis, then we're going to find surprises. And that's how we mitigate that. So just to give you an example, that picture on the left-hand side there, all those little dots are ships at the moment that are sitting off mainland China, waiting to be either loaded or offloaded. So we can see that there's a problem starting to happen. Containers, we know there's a container shortage, and that container shortage, unfortunately, is not going to go away. We've taken 150,000, even after COVID, 150,000 containers have gone out of the system because of Brexit. And the way that people are starting to build and fill them is a problem. China at the moment is almost shutting down because there's no one to load or offload that. So you're going to expect even more delays coming on. So those are the things that we need to start thinking about. What are those mitigation plans? And these are pictures from shelves of retailers to say, you know, we're out of stock. And that's where we need to start thinking about what are those plans and what are those alternatives and what flows do I need to change and what synchronization do I need to do in order to make sure that we have mitigation plans in place. So how do we build a robust supply chain? So the two key elements for building a robust supply chain is first, trust and collaboration. And when we talk about trust is, you know, how do you create trust or earn trust? And I know a lot of the conversations that we've had in the other sessions I've talked about has all been around people and working together. And this is what it is. You know, you can have the best systems in the world. You can have the best processes in the world. You can have the best tools in the world. But if we don't work together and we don't trust each other, that becomes a problem. Now, the trust needs to come from somewhere. We need to, you know, so many times I sit in a meeting and they say, this is what's going to happen. And we say, well, why is that going to happen? Where's the facts? Where's the data? Where's the information? It's all about gut feel. We can no longer run our supply chains on gut feel anymore. We need to run it's a fact-based, and that facts, when we have those hard facts, that starts building trust. The other part about the trust thing is collaboration. So we need to start collaborating with suppliers and with our customers and with our partners in a very, very different way. We cannot sit in our own little, and we now need to actually start sharing data with them because they need that data to help build their plans and to build their trust as well. So we need to get into this ecosystem going forward. But also is the visibility and the transparency as I talk about it. If you don't have the information or you don't have the data, then it makes making decisions very, very, very difficult. And we'll talk about some examples of that in the case study I'll talk about. So I like to talk about the business operations chain, because what we always focused on we focused around the supply chain. That's us. But what drives that supply chain? The supply chain is just an output, as I call it, because this output here comes from either the product or the services that you are offering, whether you're a product or a service provider, because that stems of how you set up your supply chain or how you put your supply chain together, as well as you then need to plan. So I think those who attended the earlier session, we talked about the distributions and how we can model it, and we do the modeling. But the biggest challenge that we have is, you know, if you've got 500 products or you've got 10,000 products, you need to understand, how do I turn that into a supply chain? What sort of network or infrastructure that I need? I need a very different infrastructure network with more products that I have than less products I have. We also need to model our supply chains and say, what does my supply chain need to look like when the barrel of cost of a barrel of oil is you know, $50 a barrel? What does it look like if it's $100 a barrel, and what does it look like if it's $200 a barrel? Because you'll have very different looking supply chains. So we need to think about, how do we define that? And that comes in what we call our product and our services and offering. If we want to offer our customers day one for day two, this is how we need to set up our supply chain, and this is the cost. If we want to offer day 1 for day 4 or day 5, that's a different way that we set up our supply chain. So, we often in the supply chains get beaten up for not delivering when actually we haven't set ourselves up for success in terms of the product. And this came to life really, really clearly during the COVID crisis. Because what happened for the first time was that when COVID hit and you started locking down your food services department. So if you look in general, food consumption, the 100% of food consumption that happens in the marketplace is roughly, and depends from market to country to country, about 60% comes from retailers and 40% comes from what we say food services. So food services are restaurants, bars, canteens, universities, schools offering food, etc. So you've got 40% and 60%. As soon as you start getting into the COVID and you start shutting down bars and restaurants and food services, sandwich shops and various other things, that 40% moves into the retail. And what we found was that the retail went obviously through the roof because of that demand. And you can actually model it and see exactly, depending on what shuts down, what is that increase in demand is going to happen. But a lot of these big suppliers realized that they did not have enough capacity to support that demand. So they made some decisions. They made some decisions to focus on only making one product or two products. A good example, what happened in the UK, Unilever realized that they didn't have enough Marmite or yeast and bottles and Marmite. So what they said is, we're going to stop making the 100 gram, the 125 gram, the 200 gram, the 250 gram, the 500 gram. We're only going to make 250 gram. So we just keep those lines, no changeovers, no nothing, and we just fire out a huge amount of volume, all focused on that 250 grams, and actually the sales was doubled just from one SKU because they focused on that. And that's how we sustain those supply chains, not to say we need more out of the 120 and the 250 and all of those. Working as a business, and that's why we call it a business operations decision, we made that decision to just focus on getting more volume out and using the resources that you have in the best possible way. So that's some of the things that we need to think about is, when we say the supply chain is not working, okay, let's understand the whole business operation. Let's understand our portfolio. What services do we want? Do we want to prioritize our products? How do we want to run it? And then obviously we plan against that. So just to recap, when we talk about supply chain, because always a supply chain means lots of different things to lots of different people. So what we talk about, or what I talk about when we talk about a supply chain is it starts off with the consumer. The consumer has a need, and from the consumer having a need, we buy materials, we get that from our suppliers. The suppliers move it into manufacturing. The manufacturing then need to distribute it. From the distributor, we sell it to the retail sales, and so we go along. But what we need to understand is what is our role as a supply chain are those touch points between each one of those round circles over there. So I always say it starts with demand. We need to understand what the consumer's demand is. So once we understand what the new consumer's demand is, then we're going through each of those touch points. And we need logistics every time to move something. And that means a truck. That means a container. That means a packaging. That means a pallet. And those are the things that we need to be planning and working with. And we all work in those little boxes about moving stuff around. But the key thing for us is this demand and supply. We really need to understand what is the demand and what is the supply, and how do we get that balance right. And that's what our role is moving those little boxes and playing around with that pendulum to get that balance right to make sure that it is the optimum thing. So once we've established what our supply chain is, and when this goes out of balance, what do we need to do? We need to have a plan, hopefully. So it's about establishing a plan. And the way I talk about is the first thing to establish a plan is the visibility. So actually, what is it? What is the issue? What is the problem that we need to do? And if we don't have facts and we don't have data, we go back to gut feel, and that's where it falls over. Because what we think is the issue actually might be a symptom of the issue. We need to be using facts, use some trends, and from that, we can define what is the problem statement. Once we know what the problem statement is, then we can talk about solutions. We can talk about what assumptions are we going to make and what are those options. So if we say the problem statement is we don't have enough containers, if we look at the trends, we can see that it's gone from 3 months to now 9 months. So we know that that's physically happened. We need to make some assumptions now. Are we going to assume that it's all of a sudden it's going to go back to 3 months? I don't think so, for what you've seen out of happening. Where does that happen? And this is where you need to make some assumptions that we all work to. And as we get new news, we change those assumptions, then we can redo a whole model behind. So SAPICS and ourselves were contacted in June or July last year when we had the riots? Yeah. Was it July? July, yeah. July last year by the Presidency Office to say, can we help stabilizing the supply chain? And the reason why this becomes so important is the survival of a country is the ability to get products in and out. And as soon as you shut down those ports, which brings in the majority of it, then you start having problems, and actually it leads to unrest. I know it was caused by unrest, but actually there's been a number of cases where it becomes larger unrest if you've got no food across the whole country or you don't have medicines or infrastructure. So that was a key issue, is saying, how do we stabilize the supply chain? So we got involved and we said, well, first of all, what is the problem? What is exactly the problem? Where is that pinch point? So what we did is we set up what we call a control tower. And that control tower looked at vessels, trucks, and rail, so your transportation mechanism, and then also the storage and movement of storage. So where did we store things? How did we move them, either with cranes or on the land side or the water side? And we created this control tower because we said, how do we fix something that we can't see? So what we wanted was to create the visibility, then the trends, then the plans that leads to some action. So when we looked at this, we needed to map the process. So what we first of all did says, right, okay, what is the inbound demand? Because we know it all starts with demand. So the inbound was things about vessels awaiting. What is the plan for the next 3 weeks? What are the truck and rail and various other things? So we could establish what was the inbound demand. Because without knowing what the demand is, you don't know how many cranes or how many gangs or what do you physically need. So the first thing was to establish the inbound demand. The next thing was to establish what was the outbound demand. So this is what's coming into the port. Now we have it in the port. Right, now we need to get it out of the port. So then we established what was the outbound demand. And from establishing the outbound demand, we then had a look at what available resources do we physically have. And when we talk about available resources, when we started having the conversation, they said, well, we had 115 cranes. Okay, great, let's put that in. But when you start putting that in versus your demand, you're saying, well, 115 cranes versus your demand, that's fine, there's no problem. Or the amount of capacity that we have for storage, that's not a problem. But actually, you need to not take the theoretical capacity, you need to say the demonstrated capacity, the DEMCAP that I always talk about. So how many are actually available for you to use, and how many can we use? And also, how much capacity do we actually have to store things? So these are the things that we needed to establish. And then obviously, it's your inbound, your outbound demand is what we call your requirements, less your available resources, tells you where your imbalances are, what your options are, and where you need to take any actions. So we worked very closely with the Transnet team, and they've been fantastic with the amount of information and data they have. They collect it and they get in, and we managed to pull that together, and we built these dashboards. So these dashboards were able to tell us across each of the ports where we saw from a weekly basis, because some of those discussions that we had was, oh, but that's only happened once. No, that's only happened twice. So when we got into the meetings, we could just bring this up and say, you can select your weeks, and I'll demonstrate that to you shortly. we could actually see which week, and you could also see the trends at the bottom, what was starting to happen, so we could start having some fact-based discussions. And from having those fact-based discussions, we started to see some things happen. So if you see those little red boxes around there, we saw that one of the biggest problems was the container dwell times, or the stock occupancy, which is over here. So what we were finding was that you've got a place where you take the containers off the vessel and you bring it onto the land side, and then you sort of stack them on top of each other. So that's why when you get to around about 70%, your stack is quite high. Yes, you can go to 100%, but the biggest problem is if you need one of those containers at the bottom, you've got to move all of those out the way to get to the one at the bottom. So you want to try and keep your stock occupancy as low as possible. So we said, okay, why have we got that stock occupancy so low? And then also what we found was the stage and gate times, the time that it takes for a vehicle to come in and go out, took a lot longer than we anticipated. So we said, well, maybe that's the cause for the problem. And then also we noticed that the Bay Head road was creating a lot of those problems that was delaying the stage. So maybe it's the Bay Head road. And then we found that the rail wasn't working effectively enough, and that's not just solved just yet, but there's plans on how to get around it. So we saw all these trends happening, and from those trends we were able to start building a picture. And those pictures that we started to build was that the reason why we found that the container, the dwell times or the stock occupancy started building was, yes, sometimes we didn't get enough trucks through, but actually we didn't get enough trucks through, particularly on the weekends, because people like to work during the week and not on the weekend. So then you build up more. So how do we collaborate with our suppliers to bring that? The other big problem we found was that when your container was offloaded, sometimes a lot of customers would actually leave them a lot longer there. Rather than just clearing them straight away, it was more cost effective to actually leave them in the stack that was there, or take longer time to clear in customs, etc. So what we find was that, the poor, Transnet was saying we're really trying hard to clear this, but again, this comes to the synchronization. It's the clearing agencies, it's the customers, and it's the behaviors that we start seeing that actually leave things there for a lot longer that create that problem, because now you're building up the stack and you've now got to do more moves in terms of that. So that's why we started working with the industry, and an industry forum was created so people could start understanding how they can help and how they can support this. So always when we talk about issues like this is to talk about these things when you start looking at the operations, and there's those three examples I talked about. But what's really important to understand is, what is that trend? So you see four different type of trends happening. The first trend is a hole. So you'll see that saying, oh, this is a once-off that it's happened, and it recovers, and all right, we can explain it's a once-off event, and we can all live with that. It might be a trend at the bottom that we're starting to see things creep up. Is it a step shift that the whole market or the service that we've provided has changed? Or is there a variation that we're seeing these peaks and troughs coming up? So these are really important things. We can't just take the data and say, here's the data, let me look at it and let me understand it. What I need to understand is, right, I've now got data, great. We can start making some decisions, but what bucket does that sit in? So it can help us drive some of those improvements. So I'm going to try and go onto the internet now. This hasn't been done before. That's why I have to do it on my computer, not on the main one. Cool. Let's put it into... Right, we can all see that. So this is the dashboard. This is live information of the ports. So you can see in the top right-hand corner, you've got Durban Port Pier 1, Durban Port Pier 2, bulk connections, Cape Town, Richards Bay, etc. So from this, you can see on a weekly basis any of your performances against those areas. And also, we can go in and we can see various trends for various months that can help us drive various actions across our networks. And again, this is the what we call the decision board that we use for identifying where those issues were. Let's go into Cape Town, because we are in Cape Town, aren't we? And yes, you can go in and select the various weeks, and you can see the different gauges. Oopsie. Right. Anyway, so that just gives you a view of that. I don't know how to... There we go. I'll leave it in that mode over there. So here in Cape Town, you can see the performance for a particular week, and particularly in what we do in Cape Town is also look at the number of hours lost. So you can see 10 hours were lost due to delays because of the weather, or how many vessels are sitting out at anchorage. So doing this helps us make some of the decisions, because we're always hearing, oh, we've got bad weather, but this gives us a fact to say, right, how many hours did we actually lose, and how do we move those forward? So using this is what we call, this gives you the visibility. This is the first step, as I call it. Step 1, get the visibility. Step 2, understand what the trends are and what are driving the issues. Step 3, create an action plan. So those are the 3 things that we use. This doesn't solve your problems, but it identifies where your problems are. Could we put the presentation back on? Brilliant. So that's how we addressed it and addressed a number of those issues, and now we're able to start seeing that. And we're happy to say that there's a monthly meeting with a group of about 70 of us that are looking at all these actions and taking action so we can start improving the situation. But also what's important is we talk about the now. The now is we're reacting to those issues. Now is not good enough. We need to start thinking about the future. And this just gives you an indication of how the evolutions of the vessels have increased. And what you need to also understand is your ports need to follow this as well, because you've got bigger ships coming in, and therefore you need different equipment, you need different offloading, you need different ways. So you can't be just sitting here and thinking about what's going to happen next week or the next 2 weeks or the next 3 weeks. So successful businesses are those that I call that plan, and they plan in 4 different areas. They plan in they don't plan, they schedule the here and now. But it's more about looking at what are those tactics, what's going to happen for the next 1 to 24 months, so that we can start thinking about what are those operational things that I need to think about doing. Because if you're starting to identify gaps this week, next week, or in a couple of months, that's not going to solve you if you need some infrastructure changes or you need anything else. So that's why we look at that 1 to 24 months horizon, which we call the tactical horizon. A lot of people call it S&OP, sales and operations planning, or integrated planning. But what we find is that all you're doing is reacting. If you don't have the right network in place, if you don't have the right equipment in place, if you don't have the right people and capabilities in place, it takes years to do that. So you need to start making those decisions. What we say is in the strategic area over there. An example was that Unilever decided in Europe to centralize its whole logistics operations and customer service in Poland. So what it decided was 2 or 3 years before that, it says, well, it's fine that I put everything into one town in one place, but how are we going to get the right skills and the right capabilities to run that? So what they did 2 or 3 years before they landed in the country, they went to the local universities and they said, right, these are the requirements we need for people and capabilities over the next 5 years. I want you to train these people because in 2 or 3 years we've got jobs for them, and we want to feed a job to keep feeding that through so we can make sure that happens. So those are the things that we talk about strategically. We need to be thinking about, what does my infrastructure need to look in 2 or 3 years' time based on some assumption? What is the dollar doing? What is the dollar of the barrel of oil, but also the exchange rate? And those type of things we need to be thinking now, because if we're playing in the short term, all we're doing is we're reacting, and we'll never get out of the hole that we've created. So we need to be doing both, thinking of the future, but operating the present and bringing those two together. So if I just leave you with a couple of things, we talked about this, what I call the synchronization model. And the synchronization is not just supply chain, it's everything. It's your product and your services that you offer. I work a lot with police forces. It takes 2 years to train a person up to become a police person. And you need to think about what tools, what technology do they need, what skills do they need. You start building those in. So it's not just us as a supply chain, it's every industry that we look at. So product and services, plan ahead, and that supply chain. So the 4 things, if you take away today, is first off, segmentation. Understand what your priorities are for your product and your services. Are you adding value to everything that you do? Like the Unilever example, sometimes we need to prioritize in certain things. Get the visibility, so provide the data and trends, synchronize, work with your suppliers, your partners, and that we can't do it alone anymore. You rely on and generate those plans. So you need to take into consideration your demand and your demonstrated capacity, but not only today, tomorrow as well. So that's it. So hopefully that was helpful and interesting.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Are you prepared to take some questions?
I am, yes.
Any questions from the audience?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Vanya from PEP. So the methodology followed looks absolutely amazing and the visibility is great. How do you empower the 70 people that are in the room with you to actually understand and network to be able to pull all these variables together to make the right call at that particular time? And how long do you expect that will take in that room of 70 that you have?
Yeah, very, very good question. I think, when we got the group together and we started looking at the data, there was a discussion. The discussion started off was, I always talk about people have alibis. Okay, and the alibi was, yes, that just happened once. Yes, that just happened twice. But when we said, okay, let's just understand how many times this happened, and we went week by week by week by week, and we showed them at the first stage, because we didn't have all the data, because we didn't have the history, but we had 7 weeks of data, the first meeting we had with. And we said, out of the 7 weeks, we've had this issue for 6 weeks. So that's not an alibi. And when we started having fact-based discussions, people stopped that thing and said, well, these are the facts, right? Are we going to address these facts or aren't we going to address these facts? And that's where you come into. But the problem being is, you're quite right. If you don't have that data and you don't have that information, it's just gut feel and it's my view versus your view. Well, I don't believe you, you don't believe me, so we've got a problem.
Any other questions? Oh.
This might not be a question, but just to say thank you, because your programming that you said at TFR with, we receive it daily as well. So we receive it from Durban Port.
Yes.
That's full schedule with the Cape Town stuff as well.
Yeah.
And also monthly.
Yes.
They also get together with us as well to go over the data.
Yeah.
So we appreciate it, especially from the logistics side.
Okay, great. Good to hear.
Hi, it's Kitty from Palo Logistics.
No.
You talk about synchronization, right? For many years, business people, we struggled with the concept of collaboration. And now you're moving us further to synchronization. So we're still striving to say, okay, speak to your neighbor and see if you can put your heads together. But you're saying now, think about, before you put anything in place, think about how it is going to affect your neighbor, the nation and everything. So yeah, I think we need to change our mindset in terms of how we look at things holistically.
Yes.
And it really, really, really would improve the way we do business. Can you imagine the person who put the concept Brexit and said, guys, let's vote for it, right? They never thought of Ireland, eh? Never.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No. That's very true. And how do we make a step change from, as you say? So what I always talk, it's the power of data. So all data does is tell you what the trend is or what the issue is, but you're quite right, it takes its behavior and its trust when we talking about the collaboration piece to work together. But what we find is that if you start sharing that data, if you start seeing, and there's a lot of businesses that say, I'm not going to share that data. I'm not going to share that information because I'm too scared to share that information. And I think we've got to find the balance between it. So there's these dashboards that I showed you here. This is available to the public now. So anyone can go and see that. So we've now got 114, I think, different people in the transport and logistics that have access to that data are now able to see that, and they're able to see their impact as well on that. So it's not going to solve the problem, but at least it's the first step there. Because if you get people into a room and say, right, we're here to collaborate, what are we going to collaborate about? When we start putting information and data and we say, look here, we need to collaborate on these three things, because you can see the stack is building up because you're not running on weekends. So can you put on weekend shifts? Or can you make sure that, we're giving you're able to clear it out of that stack within 2 days or something like that. But when you give people real clear saying, this is the issue, can you see it? This is what you're causing part of the problem being. Right, let's talk about how we can work together to fix a particular thing. And that's where I think we need to be very, very clear about what the issue is and what we want you to do. If we get in a room and we're saying, here, we're all here to work together because we like each other and we want to improve everything, it's not concrete enough to actually do anything. And you find that those normally don't lead to anything. So that's why it needs to be very specific what you're working on and have the right people in the room to move it forward. But yes, it's really difficult to move on.